Perfect. All right, so thanks everyone for being here at our Amnesty International meeting for Chapter 112 in Philadelphia. Tonight we have with us Alisa Gutman from the Philadelphia Human Rights Clinic, right? Is that the name of the organization? So I'm pretty unfamiliar with the Human Rights Clinic, so I'm excited to learn a little bit more about it and what it is, and that it's right here in our own community. So I'm going to just pass it to Alisa, and everyone can feel free to ask questions and stuff. And we're excited to hear about it, Alisa.
Sounds good. Thank you, Amara. Is this a crowd that likes to start with some background, like PowerPoint? Would that give everyone some frame? Or is this a crowd that, okay.
That's fine. Yeah.
Would you like to stay in the mix and so we can all see each other? Yeah, I can share here. So, okay, you guys see my slides okay?
Yep.
Great. So what I can do is give you guys an overview of asylum. I can actually see you all because it's a nice small group. Do you guys, just so I know, I mean, you're an Amnesty International group, I presume you have a reasonable understanding of the basics of asylum. Is that?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think I'll give a bit of an overview anyway, just so we're maybe all on the same page, all coming from the same perspective. So, you know, I like to start with the basic definitions that when we're talking about asylum, we're talking about a subset of immigrants. So, you know, this very simple Venn diagram going through the greater immigrant as a person who comes to live permanently in another country. A subset of immigrants are refugees, who are people who've been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution, or natural disaster. And an asylum seeker is a smaller subset of immigrants who are people who've crossed an international frontier into, into a country in which he or she hopes to be granted refugee status. And I'm going to give us some of the basic legal background to this from international law. But just to say what these terms mean, asylum is a legal status that's granted to an individual in order for them to obtain refuge in another country. And it's a very specific sort of relief, of immigration relief, that is on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So in order to gain asylum, one has to be able to prove that they either have past persecution or a well-founded fear of future persecution on account of one of those five groups. And I like to think of those simply as things that you either can't or should not have to change about yourself. Persecution is also actually very specific. Any lawyers in the room? No. So this is where this comes from, international law and then laws that we've adopted in the US. So the terminology is incredibly important here. Persecution is individualized harm inflicted by a government or by a group that the government is unable or unwilling to control. And it does not reference harm that's arising out of civil strife. It's specifically, persecution is something done to you or a very close loved one. So harm inflicted either by state action or by state inaction. It doesn't need to be physical. It can be the deliberate imposition of severe economic disadvantage or the deprivation of liberty, food, housing, employment, or essentials of life, but it must be more than mere harassment or discrimination. And so the way that we come to these is from some human rights treaties related to asylum. So in 1951, the UN developed the Convention relating to the status of refugees, which defined refugees' rights. It really defined the term refugee and the legal obligations of any states accepting refugees. In 1967 was the protocol relating to the status of refugees, which adopted the definitions that had been outlined in the 1951 convention. And the US is in fact a party to the 1967 protocol. And in 1984, is Convention Against torture, or it's called CAT. It defines torture, outlines state requirements to prevent torture within their borders, forbids forced return to countries where someone may be subject to torture. And when we talk about forcibly displaced people, we're talking about incredibly large groups of people. This comes from UN High Commission for Refugees, this infographic with more than 70 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. And the subset there, a smaller subset, are these asylum seekers. So if you guys know the basics of how immigration works, when someone is a refugee, someone who's been displaced, might be living in a refugee housing, might be living in a refugee camp in an adjacent country to where they've been displaced from, or sometimes people are internally displaced within their own country. But refugees, again, are defined. There are groups that the international community agrees are refugees. An asylum seeker is someone who's not necessarily in a refugee group and is claiming persecution and a well-founded fear of future persecution. So, I'm a physician. Why am I talking to you about this? Since I'm not an attorney versed in international law per se, and why do I do work in this field? So I do clinical evaluations of asylum seekers. I do forensic psychiatric evaluations. I'm a practicing psychiatrist. Our clinic, which I can describe to you guys when we go back to just faces, does medical and physical evaluations. And why do we do those? So what we do is we document emotional and physical harm and suffering that are related to persecution. The work we do speaks to the ways in which clinical issues may impact an asylum seeker's testimony, what impacts somebody's current state, whether that be current mental health state, current physical state, and also can document ongoing effects of persecution. Yeah. I think for you guys, I think just because Amara had indicated you guys like to play a little more fast and loose than maybe like strict PowerPoint. So let me actually bounce for you guys. These are graphs I made from the data from the UN, but I do think actually, I will go right here. So I actually think it's useful to talk about what we mean by torture. So this is actually from US code. So this is what the US says is torture. So it means an act committed by a person acting under the color of law, specifically intended to inflict severe physical or mental pain or suffering upon another person within his custody or control. And because it's legal terminology, we go a deeper layer in defining what do we mean by severe mental pain or suffering. And the main definitions here are either intentional infliction of severe physical pain, administration of mind-altering substances intended to disrupt someone's senses, the threat of imminent death, or the threat of any of those things to a loved one or another person. And so when we think about torture, it actually falls into three basic categories. We think about physical torture, sexual violence, and psychological torture. Although when I do evaluations of people who've really fall under some of the strictest definitions here, when we're talking about persecution based on political belief, oftentimes we're looking at torture from all three categories that's perpetrated against one person. Really, when it comes down to it, we can get out of those more clinical definitions, and torture is the deliberate intention to destroy someone's well-being. It's intended to destroy and impact someone's will and their dignity. It's documented occurring in over 150 countries, including our own. And it's really a socio-political act. It's a strategy used to undermine political leadership and intimidate communities so they'll submit to the will of those in power or those seeking power. It's a tool. And why would somebody try to seek asylum after being in those circumstances? So it's actually considered a golden ticket of immigration status, if you will. It's an excellent immigration status for anyone familiar with the varying statuses people can have. It provides security at its very simplest level, so not living with this fear of deportation, detainment, repeated torture, but also things like support, so temporary government support, job training potentially, family reunion, which is why this is such a golden ticket, Most other immigration statuses don't afford this. This affords somebody, if they're granted asylum, the ability for their first degree relatives to gain asylum with them. Also work authorization and new opportunity and healing. So recognition by one state that your state acted to harm you. There's a legitimacy in that being granted. And so why do I do this work? Our clinic, the Philadelphia Human Rights Clinic, works in partnership with Physicians for Human Rights. And the primary purpose of doing a clinical evaluation is to establish facts related to alleged torture. I don't know if anybody in the room has a personal or a family refugee story. I do. My mother was a refugee who was resettled in Philadelphia when she was 7 as a Holocaust survivor. And when her family was fleeing, you know, they didn't have papers like, we're sorry, we were going to kill you and didn't yet. So you don't flee from a region with documentation. People don't get tortured by their government and receive a letter saying, we're so sorry about that, enjoy America. The way that people have scars from events like this, or they have physical scars, although more often than not in the modern era, torture is performed intentionally to avoid leaving physical scars. And so really, more often than not, the scars we're looking for are psychiatric scars, brain scars, things that as a psychiatrist, I'm able to elicit on an examination. And so really we're finding critical pieces of evidence that would otherwise not be present for this person while they're going through their court case. And the national average, it varies by year. Bit of a hit in the past several years. But traditionally, the national average for asylum granting is somewhere in the 30 to 40% range. And when Physicians for Human Rights is involved, their confirmed case outcomes are closer to 90%. There's very little that I do clinically as a physician that increases someone's chances of a bad outcome from 40% to less than to 90%. It's a pretty amazing intervention to do. I'm actually going to stop here. That would be perhaps for another time, if anyone were interested in the dismantling of the asylum program over the 4 years of the Trump administration, I'd be happy to detail that. I'm not sure I can stomach it at 7:30 on a Thursday, but you know, actually what I could do is just show you that first slide. So this was Professor Karen Masalo is a giant in this field who happened to be so gracious as to share a few slides with me on this topic. And this actually gives in chronological order Trump administration selected policies. So it started with metering, went on to family separation, prohibiting claims not at native ports of entry. P.S. It's literally in the law that you do not have to come at a port of entry. So that got knocked down pretty quickly in court. The Remain in Mexico policy, which like many laws intended to harm people are named something that sounds cheery and like it's not going to harm anybody. So that was the migrant protection protocols. But I think if you watch the news, you're aware that the Remain in Mexico policies were quite judgmental. Transit ban based on COVID, that transit ban, then the CDC border closure. And so it really goes on and on. We probably don't even have enough time to even think through that. And I'm gonna skip those just to give you guys a better sense then for what the asylum process is and what it means. So people enter the US and you enter either in a documented fashion, for example, in a temporary fashion with a tourist visa, business visa, student visa, or someone may enter the US in an undocumented fashion, so without a legal status to be here. This up top here is considered an affirmative process, and below here is defensive. So if somebody does come into the US with a legal immigration status and they apply for asylum within a year, they actually possibly can meet with an immigration officer and potentially be granted asylum without even needing to meet with an immigration judge. I'd say the more frequent that we would hear about, especially what we've been hearing on the news with a lot of asylum seekers coming through our southern border, are people who are coming through without status in the US. And at the border, they're requesting a credible fear interview. So at that point, from the credible fear interview, somebody can be approved that their story sounds credible to this immigration officer who is deemed, who's given some training in this. It really varies. People's background that do this position vary, but they're supposedly given adequate training in this, and then can either approve, which somebody would then be moved to detention, and then have a hearing before an immigration court, or they could be denied and immediately deported. So there are a few pathways to the immigration judge, and then potentially approval or potentially denial and deportation. The fact of the matter is that there are huge disparities in asylum cases. This comes from an article from 2018 that actually looks at data from the 3 years prior, and then in the light pink, 2016 to 2017. And it's pretty consistent. You can see like comparing. And, Philly courts, it's not bad. It's not a bad place to be if you're seeking asylum. I started doing asylum work something like probably more than 15 years ago in Atlanta. You don't want to seek asylum in Atlanta. Even more than the regional disparities that we see in asylum granting are the disparities among different judges. So here we're looking at the 2 courts in our region, and these data you can just pull from Track Immigration Report online, and I pulled the ones for us regionally. And so the Philadelphia court system from 2012 to 2017 and the York court for the same time period. So I don't know about you guys, but if I were seeking asylum, I would be very excited to be in Judge Honeyman's court. And I would be quite disappointed to be in Judge Arthur's court. I think, very clearly, if it's, and I'm just going to pop out actually from this, I'm going to stop sharing. Very clearly, if those data and the disparities are unsettled to the group, are not unsettled to the group, rather. The point is that just like many things with our justice system, in the immigration justice system, these things are not granted based on necessarily the facts of the case. Like if you looked at those regional data, we're looking at incredible bias and disparities based on region of the country and based on judge. And so it winds up being a potential crapshoot, no matter how strong your asylum case is. And the fact of that is really unacceptable when we're talking actually about people's lives. So if somebody has a forced return to a home country where they were tortured, the likelihood, and in particular, but not necessarily only if they were tortured by their home government, the likelihood of them being forced returned to their home country and living a jolly, happy life with sunshine and rainbows is something around negative 40%. 50% of statistics are made up. So the fact of the matter is that as a physician and as a forensically trained psychiatrist, it's something I'm quite compelled to assist people with then. So when you have the assistance of having a physician who can document and give an objectivity to a trauma narrative and to the manifestations of trauma, if they exist, this is something that can really support someone in a court case. And so in Philadelphia Human Rights Clinic, we are a clinic of medical students and physicians. So it's a medical student-run clinic. I founded the clinic with medical students at Penn close to a decade ago. And what we found after we were in business, if you will, for a few years, we had a group of students from Jefferson Medical who came to us initially thinking about starting their own clinic, but then perhaps they didn't have quite the mentorship in the field. And there's not that much asylum work that goes through Philly. There's a good amount, but maybe not enough for 5 medical schools. So we invited the Jefferson students to join in with us. We changed our name from Penn Human Rights Clinic at the time to Philadelphia Human Rights Clinic, and we didn't even have to change our logo. It was fantastic. And we, after inviting Jefferson students, probably a year, maybe 2 years later, students from Drexel came to us. And then in the past, say 4 years, we've had now students from Temple join and students from PCOM join. So all 5 area medical schools are involved with the clinic now. We have student leadership from each of those schools. It's really quite remarkable. There's nothing like it in the city. There's actually nothing else like it in the country.
Wow.
Where you have students from several medical schools working together in such a really amazing collaborative way. The student leadership are really remarkable. And then I am the medical director and the founder, and I work with the students in education. Every year we host a Philadelphia area asylum training, although in the virtual era now, we have people from all over who attend our training. We train area physicians, area psychologists mostly, and also some area social workers in how to do forensic evaluations for asylum seekers. So we have several strong missions. So among them, one in medical education. So in teaching the next generation. We have a strong service mission. Clearly, all of our evaluators are volunteer. We do all volunteer time and all volunteer education time, and then also have a strong mission in community partnerships and working with other area organizations that have similar missions as ours. And that's the basics. That's what we do. So we see asylum seekers. We get referrals from Physicians for Human Rights, so from their national organization. We also have a lot of different relationships now with area immigration attorneys. So we'll often get referrals directly from them. We work closely with HIAS and with NSC, who are the 2 refugee resettlement agencies. I'm seeing lots of nodding in our region. And so we enjoy great collaborations with our 2 refugee agencies, and then from Physicians for Human Rights and also other area immigration attorneys. And the students partner casework with a volunteer physician or psychologist or social worker, and then they pair them with a medical student volunteer who serves as a scribe, and then the either attending physician or the psychologist will then write up a forensic report for the court to explain any clinical findings that they have that might be able to contribute to someone's asylum case. That's what we do.
So how do you fund your work? Do you get grants, or how do you do that?
Yeah, on a shoestring.
Uh-huh.
So so during COVID, there's even been less funding. Like the main things that we do, or we run this training, and we used to feed people at it, but when it's online, you don't have to feed anyone anymore. And all of our physicians and psychologists and other evaluators all do all of their work volunteer. The students do all of their work volunteer. So really mainly clerical money. All of the student organizations have graduate medical education funds that they contribute into the organization. So it's sort of 5 mini chapters, and then all contributing to our organization at large.
Okay.
And so on a shoestring, we don't need much. We need time.
Is this your full-time work, or do you have another job on the side?
This is not my full-time work. This is
Right.
all my volunteerism.
Okay.
This is I laugh only because I have an actual job where somebody pays me
Okay.
to treat patients, and I have another free job where I teach medical students and residents at Penn, and then this one is I call it my heart work. So I do this work as my volunteerism, as a personal ethic that I've always had as a socially responsible physician, and as a human.
How many like asylum cases typically come to Philadelphia in like a year's time period, I guess, let's say?
I don't have the data off the top of my head. I'm trying to think if I have it in any emails. Like the better question for us would be just how many evaluations did you do last year? We actually didn't have a big slowdown, but I don't know the numbers.
Even a guess is fine. I'm just curious because you said that, you know, Philadelphia is not like there's not a ton of asylum seekers that are coming to Philadelphia, but I just wonder with the rates being so high of.
Yeah, so I see that because you see, like, so most asylum seekers you're going to see at border crossings, right? And so you're seeing like the numbers that you'd be seeing greater or be like the ones that we tend to have seen in varying ways in the news over the last several years. The like some of the communities that want that wall built. So just